Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Next thing you know the next thing. Next is Now is a short podcast discussing agriculture's emerging next-gen tech and trends as they're happening in our industry. Next is Now, presented by GFL Ag. Listen where you get your podcasts today.
Good day, and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, March the 6th. On this episode of The Word, yes, it's March. So what does that mean exactly? Well, yeah, we'll talk about that. It's cool discussions, lots of stuff on the Twitterverse, and Commodity Classic. Come on, people, I want to talk about that briefly as well. And then from there on in, it will be agronomy answers, because I've been lax. I've missed answering a few questions that have come in. We will try to catch up on this particular episode of The Word. Let's go. First off, yes, March. So, meteorological spring. We are into it. Not the lunar spring, that's March 21st, but nonetheless, that we are just into that time of year, and the weather, actually you would think it is May maybe, or certainly April rather than March. Nature Nut Nick, the 4th of March, in his wheat field. So I was just this Monday at 2 degrees soil depth, almost 12 degrees Celsius soil temperature. That is corn and soybean planting temperature. It's too early, don't get me wrong, but wow, incredible that it could be that warm. By the way, Nick's saying that February 2024, the second warmest on record, actually 1998 was warmer in his records, which only go back to, 1980 something, the least amount of snow, so absolutely warm and dry. But here in Ontario, March came in like a lamb, like the calmest of lambs ever, just a wonderful, beautiful summer-like weather. You go to Western Canada, the exact opposite, blizzards and snow, and I mean, they need the moisture, but oh my gosh, the roads were horrendous, the wind chill was terrible, and so totally different weather in Eastern Canada, or certainly in Ontario. The Maritimes were a bit different than Ontario as well, but Ontario, the exact opposite of what the Western Canadian farmer experienced. And this old adage, by the way, this old adage is a wives' tale. It means nothing, but everybody uses it. March comes in like a lamb, it'll go out like a lion. Comes in like a lion, it goes out like a lamb. Well, somebody's going to be right. Either Western Canada is going to be right, or Ontario, Eastern Canada is going to be right, because the chances of it being that opposite at the end of March are pretty slim. Could happen, but pretty slim. And yeah, just a little bit of fun from that perspective. Hey, let's move on. A caller saying, Peter, you talked last week about how with no ice on the Great Lakes, it really didn't matter to what was going to happen out there, and that it could start raining anytime. And if it rained anytime, we'd be late to plant. And his comment was, it's not the rainfall, it's actually how much drying weather we get after the rainfall. I would counter it's both. You said in 2019, below normal rainfall, and the soil didn't dry out, and we didn't get planting till June, and you're 100% right, but we still had some rain. And if we get lots of rain, you can have lots of drying weather, and it never gets dry in between because it just always continues to rain. So it's both, but you are correct. Even if we have below normal rainfall, if we don't have good evaporation, warm, sunny, windy days, it can take a long time for that ground to dry out. So is it an early spring? It's certainly an early spring from the wheat and the alfalfa and the maple trees. Everything is starting to get going. 12 degrees soil temperature at 2 inches. The soil biology wakes up. So things are moving, but that doesn't mean we will plant early. That's for sure. All right, let's move on. Yes, the Commodity Classic last week, and gosh, I didn't get there. And so what did you learn? For the growers that went there, what did you learn? I heard that Sean Castile from Purdue University, a soybean guy, had some really cool stuff on sulphur and on nitrogen fixation. I got to track that down, but it's really become one of those meetings that you need to be at if you're going to sense the flavor of where agriculture is headed. I didn't get there. I need you to tell me what you learned. Here's another really cool one. And so Viren D'Souza on Twitter posted a picture of the amount of agriculture in northern Ontario versus the amount of agriculture in northern Quebec. And so this is really the big clay belt that goes across that area all through northern Quebec and northern Ontario. Well, not all through, but a big swath. And astounding. In that part that Viren sent the picture out of, in northern Ontario, virtually no agriculture at all. You get to the border, get into Quebec, tons of agriculture. And people are asking, why is that and what happened, and lots of different discussions. One of the things that I think did drive it was the amount of quota that Quebec had, and so they developed that area, and lots of farmers farm that area and have dairy operations. I believe, at least Barry certainly said that was part of it. And it's also how the provincial government supported that. We have good programs in Northern Ontario right now, but we're still, we've got lots of acres there to develop. And Francois Tardif, University of Guelph, saying, is it a good thing or a bad thing that Northern Ontario isn't developed? I would say you look at it as an opportunity, and I know lots of farmers down here in southwestern Ontario are looking at moving to northern Ontario, or at least having some acres up there, because it's so tough to grow down here. The problem with northern Ontario right now, number one, is how far away are you from the market? Number two is infrastructure. There just isn't the infrastructure up there. That hasn't been developed yet. And could you ever see that on Viren's picture that he tweeted out? Lots of roads, little villages, whatnot in northern Quebec and in northern Ontario in that part. Nope, nothing, just absolutely nothing. So that infrastructure would also have to be developed. Okay, one last quick note before we get into the agronomy answers, and that was from Mark. Mark tweeted out a great little video and some comments. Man, dual tires can be such a hazard. And this is my farm safety moment. I haven't had a farm safety moment for a little while. Safety, safety, safety. And Mark showed how they used to store their duals flat, but getting them up on the trailer, like there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. Goodness, buy a tire handler. Mark showed the video. One person can handle the dual safely. There's almost zero risk to it falling on them. And Mark said in his tweet that before they bought the tire handler, which they just got recently, they had 3 instances where a dual fell over and narrowly missed someone. And some of these duals have weights on them and are fully loaded with calcium. And I'm going, Mark, do you really need that much weight? Like, we're trying to take weight off things mostly, not add weight. But nonetheless, if that fell over and you were underneath it, she's all bad. So please, watch duals, safety, think twice, act once. Let's all be in great shape by the time we get to planting, and by the time we end planting as well, by the way. Okay, I want to move into the agronomy answers. First up, Mike saying, Peter, on winter wheat, can I spread Tiger 90 and make that my sulfur source? So what's really interesting is that I had a great discussion with Kelvin about this exact topic at a meeting on wheat that Parrish and Heimbecker sponsored, and Kelvin is doing exactly that. But from an agronomy standpoint, there's some real concerns. The reason is this. Tiger 90 is elemental sulfur. The plant does not pick up elemental sulfur, it picks up sulfate. And so we've talked about this before, but that elemental sulfur, we need the thiobacillus to act on it, to work on it, to turn it from elemental sulfur into sulfate so the plant can pick it up. Early in the spring, and remember, the wheat crop's demand for sulfur is really quite early in the spring. 91% of the sulfur in the wheat plant by anthesis, 50% I believe in by second node. So very early demand. Early demand, most springs, cold soils, thiobacillus not active, doesn't work on the elemental sulfur quickly enough to provide that sulfur to the wheat crop. Now, mind you, next 12 degrees Celsius, perhaps this year would be an anomaly where that soil biology does get working quickly enough to provide it, but most of the time we would think that doesn't work. In Kelvin's case, he thinks it's been working pretty well for him, and the interesting thing about sulfur is that we don't lose it the same way we lose nitrogen over the winter. And so you can actually build a sulfur soil supply. So if you have done this for a few years, that process might work. You would have enough sulfate sulfur in the fall. You will lose some of it, but you won't lose the entire bank of sulfate in the fall. And that would mean that you could actually supply that sulfate sulfur to the wheat crop in the spring. I would say that if you're going to spread elemental sulfur in the fall, certainly on alfalfa, we would say 50 pounds. For wheat, if you're putting on 20 or 25 pounds of sulfate sulfur in the spring, I would think you'd have to go higher than that. We don't have data, but I would think you'd probably want to be 40 pounds until you built up that sulfur bank in the soil. Okay, enough on that. Mike also saying, hey, I don't have Fertility on my drill for winter wheat. If I broadcast my phosphorus, I have a 15 part per million soil test. If I broadcast phosphorus, how much more phosphorus do I need to get the same result, the same yield boost as seed placed? And so in our data, and there's Western Canadian data that supports this as well, but typically it takes 4 pounds, 4 times as much phosphorus broadcast as it does seed placed. And it sort of makes sense because the roots are going to find the seed placed because they come out and it's right there. Wheat does have lots of surface feeder roots, but we know that wheat demand for phosphorus is super early. So if you broadcast it, it just takes a lot longer for it to find the phosphorus. The Michigan State data says it finds the phosphorus. Our data says that it takes 4 times as much phosphorus broadcast, and you never quite get quite as much yield boost. You just can't ever manage to get that 7 bushels. You'll get maybe 5 bushel yield boost from broadcast, but that's still pretty good. Greg saying, okay, so on this whole situation, I put fertilizer ahead of my soybeans for my wheat crop, and that was back last spring. Harvested the soybeans, planted my wheat. I've got corn row symptoms in my wheat. I know it's low phosphorus. So it's early. What about nitrogen plus phosphorus this spring? Or do I just say that doesn't work? We just got to suffer with the wheat the way it is this year. We'll build the phosphorus with manure and fertilizer phosphorus after the wheat comes off before the cover crop. And so, Greg, I'm going to say do both because our nutrient uptake data is really cool. That phosphorus uptake is a straight line right through to plant maturity, and it's about 0.17 pounds per day. Now, we apparently, and go back in my records, and Matthew was right. Matthew Arts said to me, Peter, we have looked at this before. We did not see a boost to spring applied phosphorus. But in Greg's situation, this is a low phosphorus soil test. Try it. Do some strips with the nitrogen plus phosphorus this spring, and let's see if we can't get a yield boost there. On low soil test, I think we probably can, but then this fall, I still want you to use that manure and build that phosphorus soil test with fertilizer phosphorus if you can afford to, and that will also help the cover crop, and it will help all your crops moving forward. Okay, Ben saying, yeah, let's carry on fertility because this fall potash, Tony Vine, broadcast fall potash works better on corn, and we just can't seem to get enough potash on a low soil test, enough potash in that starter zone to do the same as broadcast. And Ben asking some great questions. He says, do we have Ontario data that supports that? And what about on soybeans? What's the situation there? And we do not have Ontario data that I'm aware of that would support what Tony says. Now, I guess if I have to look at that, I'm going to probably broadcast in the fall that potash anyway on a low soil test just to build the soil test up and to get the maximum benefit out of that potash in the fall. We've always thought that we probably got a little more boost from fall applied potash than we did spring applied potash, because the rain would move that fall applied potash into the soil and where the roots were, whereas in the spring it's often in that top inch. If the top inch gets dried out, we're not going to get the same availability. But on the soybean crop, horse spawners work, man, broadcast potash in the spring works, full stop. Soybeans do have more surface feeder roots than corn, so soybeans may be different from corn from that perspective, but we know broadcast potash in the spring works on soybeans. We're not clear on corn, but we will say on corn, broadcast phosphorus in the spring does not work. You either put it in the strip in a 2x2 band or seed placed, you broadcast it. It just doesn't work, and that's because corn doesn't have a lot of surface feeder roots the way that wheat and soybeans do. Okay, want to move on. And Tom's saying, Peter, you're talking about fertilizing cover crop oats. Based on Dave Hooker, Manish Rosada's work, we want 50 pounds of nitrogen on our cover crop oats so we don't have a yield drag on the following corn crop. What about if I grow cereal rye as a cover crop following my soybeans? Do I need nitrogen on the cereal rye? And my answer in that situation is, first, we don't have good data, but next, we do know that if you're going to corn following soybeans with a cereal rye cover crop, boy, all the data says you need more nitrogen on that corn crop in order to balance off the nitrogen that the cereal rye crop ties up, and also to help out with root diseases that can transfer. I'm quite sure, Tom, that it will depend a little bit on how big that rye gets, but the data suggests, and again, this is Shalimar Armstrong's data from Purdue, 60 additional pounds of nitrogen. And I'm quite sure I can hear Mark and Delmarva saying, but Peter, once you get that cycling, that you probably don't need that additional nitrogen, or if you do, it's because you're getting higher yields, and that's awesome if we're getting higher yields, but you definitely don't want to short that corn crop for nitrogen in the spring. I don't think that we're going to put nitrogen on the rye crop following soybeans because it just doesn't have enough time to grow in the fall and utilize that nitrogen. Okay, want to move on. We had a really good discussion and some questions coming in about liquid versus dry fertilizer. At the end of the day, it's a cost per unit of nitrogen versus a field efficiency argument. And I hope Lindsay and Jay will link the Real Ag radio discussion that Sean Haney and I had in the post. But to summarize it quickly, liquid is almost always more expensive than dry, sometimes twice as expensive, sometimes even more than twice as expensive per unit of actual nutrient. And man, with today's economics, how do you justify that? But with liquid, you can plant more acres in a day. It's just more efficient in the field. We're generally using lower volumes, although if you actually replace all the nutrients, you'd be using just as many pounds of product, maybe more. Regardless, if I can get more acres planted per day and I get all of my corn crop planted in the ideal window, that makes me dollars for sure. So it is a field efficiency versus price per unit. I'm a dry guy because I'm a cheap guy, just the way I'm built, but it definitely, I don't have many acres, and so field efficiency is less important to me. Okay, a question of a caller saying, hey Peter, you talked about split nitrogen and increasing the protein on grain corn. Does that work on silage corn? And my answer is absolutely. If you look at the data, the amount of fertilizer nitrogen that we get into those crops, boy, it's way higher. And I don't have the actual data. I'm not sure whether Dr. Vine has or not. I didn't reach out to him, but it's pretty clear in the data set that even in the stover, when we split nitrogen, we have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio where we split, which means a higher protein in that. So yes, I think you split nitrogen on silage, on corn silage, you are going to see higher protein. Last question here. Do I roll alfalfa? No, do not do it. Man, I mean, you can roll winter wheat and get away with it. They do it in the UK. I'm not sure it helps at all. We've never been able to show a benefit. But alfalfa is different. If it's frost heaved, now that crown, that growing point is 2 or 3 inches above the soil. You roll that, you're bending that root over, you might break that root. And even if that isn't very frost heaved, there's all those little buds, those crown buds that developed last fall. You break them off, it's got to grow new crown buds, and that will just delay maturity. The data on alfalfa is clear. Do not roll alfalfa in the spring. It has nothing but bad results. Last but not least here, we will do a quick video on nitrogen on wheat. It's too early for the most part, but if it stays warm, we have to look at when we're gonna go. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully that is out tomorrow. And with that, that's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, March the 6th. Keep the questions coming, man, and I'll keep talking. See you next week. Bye now.